sat on the edge of his bed, eyes hollow. "I have to go home," he said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The funeral, the customs. I have to." In Akon Town, the burial of a loved one was sacred. It wasn't just about laying someone to rest. It was about gathering, remembering, healing. The family must return home, must sit in the circle of mourning, must tell stories so the spirit would find peace. But in workers' country, absence was a risk. The warehouse didn't wait for anyone's grief. James stared at his hands. "If I leave now, I'll lose this job. You know how they are." Tony looked at him, eyes soft but unwavering. "Don't even think about it. You go. I'll cover for you, just like you did for me." James shook his head. "It's not the same. You could have been fired too back then. I can't let you take that risk again." Tony leaned forward, his voice firm. "It is the same, James. You saved my life. You worked yourself half to death so I could get better. This is my turn. Let me do this for you." James looked up then, eyes glassy with tears. "I don't deserve a friend like you." Tony smiled faintly. "We're not friends, James. We're brothers." For a long moment they sat in silence, the kind that says more than words ever could. When dawn came, James packed what little he had, a worn jacket, a few shirts, the old photograph of his mother he kept in his wallet. Tony woke early to see him off. At the bus terminal, the city was just beginning to stir. Steam rose from food stalls, the air thick with the smell of fried dough and diesel. Commuters shuffled past, bundled against the morning chill. James turned to Tony, his face drawn but calm now. "You're my brother, Tony. I trust you." Tony clasped his shoulder, forcing a smile. "Go home. Take care of your people. Don't worry about the rest." James nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Then he turned and walked toward the bus. The crowd swallowed him up, his figure fading into the gray mist of the morning. Tony stood there long after the bus had gone, his hands deep in his pockets, his breath fogging in the cold air. He felt an ache in his chest, not just for James's loss, but for the weight of what he had promised. He didn't know that this moment, this quiet, ordinary goodbye, was the last time their friendship would be whole. The weight of promises. At first, Tony kept his word. He worked 2 shifts just as James had once done. The long hours were brutal. The warehouse, always loud, seemed even louder without James's steady presence beside him. Every clang of metal rang sharp in his skull. The days blurred together. Dawn, sweat, darkness, repeat. He told himself it was only for a little while, just until James came back. He remembered the nights James had carried him through fever, how he'd woken to find his friend's hands blistered, his body shaking from exhaustion, and yet still smiling. So Tony gritted his teeth and did the same. But James's absence hollowed the world. The apartment was too quiet. No laughter, no soft humming from the stove, no low voice reading out numbers from their budget notebook. The other bed lay neatly made, untouched. Every time Tony glanced at it, a sharp loneliness stabbed through him. The first few nights, he tried to keep the routine alive. He cooked rice for 2, sat by the window as if James might walk in any moment. But eating alone dulled even the taste of food. Sometimes he'd leave the extra plate out until morning, untouched and cold. Work became harder. The foreman, Harlan, seemed to hover more now, barking orders, watching with suspicion. There was always more to do, more crates to lift, more targets to meet. Tony's muscles screamed, his eyes burned, and his body began to run on fumes. Still, every morning before leaving, he whispered to himself, just one more shift, one more day for James. But exhaustion doesn't negotiate. It came for him quietly. One morning his alarm rang, and he simply didn't move. His limbs felt like lead, his thoughts slow and tangled. He blinked, saw the pale light slipping through the curtains, and realized with a jolt that he'd overslept. He jumped up, heart racing. By the time he reached the warehouse gates, The second shift had already started. The foreman glared, writing something down on his clipboard. Tony muttered apologies, promising it wouldn't happen again. He told himself it was just once. No one would notice. But the next day his body refused to rise again. Then came another and another. Each time he found a way to justify it. Just for today, he said. I'll make up for it tomorrow. The days slipped through his fingers like sand. The warehouse noticed. They always did. Workers were watched, measured, tracked. Tony began to see his name scrawled on notices, warnings pinned near the time clock. The messages they sent went to James's company email, cold, formal words that meant nothing in the silence of a small village without reliable internet. By the third week, Tony had stopped pretending. He was working only his own shifts again, dragging himself home each night in a fog of guilt and fatigue. Sometimes, when he passed James's empty bed, he'd pause, staring at the neat pillow, the folded blanket. James will understand, he'd murmur. He knows how hard this is. But the words rang hollow. Guilt gnawed at him in quiet moments. It crept in as he lay awake at night, listening to the hum of the old bulb. He saw James's face in his mind, steady, kind, unwavering, and the memory of his trust burned like a fever. And beneath the guilt, something darker began to grow, a quiet resentment he didn't dare name. He had kept the promise as long as he could. Hadn't he? He had worked until his hands bled, until his knees trembled. How much more could one man give? He didn't want to think it, but part of him whispered that it wasn't fair, that James's misfortune had become his burden too, that maybe, just maybe, friendship shouldn't always hurt this much. When the month finally turned and James's return drew near, Tony felt an odd relief mixed with dread. He rehearsed what he'd say, how he'd explain the missed shifts, the warnings, the exhaustion. James would understand. He'd always been the calm one, the forgiving one. They would fix it together. That was what Tony believed. But fate had already moved its pieces, quietly, without mercy. And as Tony lay awake the night before James's return, staring at the ceiling's cracks like a map of choices gone wrong, he felt a weight in his chest that no amount of sleep could lift. He didn't know it yet, but the bond that had carried them through childhood, sickness, and distance was already beginning to tear, thread by thread. The breaking point. The bus from Akon Town arrived just before dawn, the city still wrapped in fog and factory smoke. James stepped off, suitcase in hand, his eyes hollow but his heart steady. The ache of his mother's funeral still lingered, a dull, constant throb, but he was ready to return to something familiar, to work, to Tony, to the rhythm that had kept him going before everything changed. He walked to the warehouse with the weariness of a man twice his age. The metal gates loomed large against the gray sky, the same clang of machinery echoing from within. For a moment, he even felt grateful for the sound. It meant life, movement, purpose. He adjusted his jacket and approached the foreman's booth. "Harlan, morning," he said, forcing a polite smile. "Reporting back to duty." The foreman looked up from his clipboard, brows furrowing in confusion. "James, what are you doing here?" James blinked. "My shift. I'm back." There was a pause, long enough for something cold to settle in James's chest. "You were terminated," Harlan said flatly, flipping a paper over. 3 weeks ago. No notice, no contact. You abandoned your post." James stared at him, the words not fitting into meaning. "Terminated? That can't be right. My friend Tony, he was covering my shifts. He promised." The man sighed, impatient. "He worked a few days, maybe a week. Then he stopped showing up too. Rules are rules. We don't run a charity here." For a moment, James didn't move. The warehouse noise swelled around him, forklifts grinding, crates slamming shut. But it all felt distant, muffled, like he was underwater. Terminated. Stopped showing up. Tony. The world tilted slightly. His hand tightened around the handle of his suitcase until his knuckles whitened. "Thank you," he said numbly, and turned away before the foreman could say anything else. He walked home in silence, The streets of workers' country stretched endlessly before him, gray buildings fading into gray sky. The wind carried the faint hum of traffic and the smell of diesel, but he noticed none of it. His mind played the same thought over and over. Tony stopped coming. Tony promised. When he reached their apartment, the door creaked open easily. It was unlocked. Tony sat at the small table, a mug of cold tea in front of him, his eyes fixed on nothing. The room was dim, the single bulb flickering weakly. When he looked up and saw James standing in the doorway, guilt washed across his face like a shadow. "James, thank God you're back. But the words died before they formed. James dropped his suitcase by the door. "They fired me," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but it trembled beneath the surface. "Because you stopped." Tony's throat tightened. "James, please listen. I was exhausted. I tried, I really did, but You tried?" The words cut sharp, each syllable trembling. "You tried?" He took a step closer, his eyes glistening with disbelief. "You promised me, Tony. You swore you'd hold on. You looked me in the eye and said you'd cover for me. I thought," Tony stammered, his hands shaking. "I thought they'd understand. I thought if I explained, they'd let it pass." "Explain what?" James interrupted, his voice cracking. "That you got tired? That my mother's death wasn't worth the effort?" Tony flinched as if struck. "Don't say that, please. Don't." "I carried you when you were weak," James said, his voice breaking now. "Do you remember? I worked myself half to death to keep you from losing that job. And you," he swallowed hard, unable to finish. "You let me drown while I was grieving." The silence that followed was unbearable. The hum of the bulb, the distant sound of rain against the window, even Tony's ragged breathing, all of it pressed in on them like the walls themselves were listening. Tony lowered his head. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I could do it. I thought I was strong enough." James shook his head slowly. "You were. You just didn't want to anymore." He turned away, crossing the room in small, deliberate movements. He opened his duffel bag, the same one he'd taken home for the funeral, and began packing his few belongings, his folded clothes, a worn photograph, a small notebook with calculations from their shared dreams. "James, please!" Tony's voice broke, trembling with desperation. "Don't go. We can fix this. I'll talk to them. I'll beg if I have to. Just stay. Don't leave me like this." James paused at the door, one hand on the frame. For a long time he didn't speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet, almost too calm. "You can't fix this, Tony." He turned his head slightly, just enough for Tony to see the tears in his eyes. "Some bonds," he said softly, "once broken, can never be put back together." Then he was gone. The door closed with a slow, echoing click that sounded louder than any slam. Tony stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door as if it might open again. When it didn't, he sank to the floor, his breath coming in uneven gasps. His hands trembled against the cold tile. The apartment felt foreign now, hollow, stripped of warmth and laughter. The second bed sat empty again, but this time it was more than absence. It was punishment. He sat there until night fell, the shadows stretching long and sharp across the room. Memories came in waves. 2 boys running barefoot through Akon Town, the sound of their laughter over cheap meals. James's voice saying, "We have each other. Isn't that enough?" Now the silence answered back, cruel and final. When dawn came, the light slipped through the cracked curtains, falling across the empty bed opposite his. Tony stared at it for a long time, his chest hollow, his hands still trembling. He realized then that what he had lost was more than a friend. It was the best part of himself. The part that believed, that hoped, that trusted. And as the days stretched into weeks, the silence in that apartment became his sentence. For in the quiet, he could still hear James's voice, echoing through his mind like a wound that would never close. "I carried you when you were weak. And you let me drown when I was grieving.